Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
Murder in the Hall of Mirrors, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome to Cozy Mysteries, where the most perplexing cases unfold in the most unexpected places. I'm Stephen, and today I'll be sharing with you a tale that begins with the innocent delights of a seaside carnival, but quickly transforms into something far more sinister. Our story takes us to the windswept coast of Brighton, where even the most elaborate illusions pale in comparison to the deceptions of the human heart. Chapter 1. The Carnival's Dark Secret. The Brighton Summer Carnival had been drawing visitors for 3 days when death decided to join the festivities. The year was 1925, and the carnival sprawled across the pier like a glittering spider's web of lights and laughter. Striped tents housed everything from fortune-tellers to strongmen, while the sweet aroma of toffee apples and candy floss mingled with the salt air of the English Channel. Among the crowd of holidaymakers, one figure moved with particular purpose, a small, dapper Belgian gentleman whose egg-shaped head turned this way and that, observing everything with keen green eyes. Hercule Poirot had not come to Brighton for pleasure. His presence was requested by the carnival's owner, Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, who had been receiving threatening letters for the past 2 weeks. "Someone wants to destroy my business," Hartwell had explained during their morning meeting in his cluttered caravan office. "They know things, personal things about my past, things that could ruin me if they became public knowledge." The letters themselves were curious documents, written on expensive stationery in an educated hand, yet deliberately vague in their threats. "The past remembers what the present chooses to forget," read one. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," proclaimed another. Each message was signed only with the initial N, and each demanded increasingly specific meetings at various locations around Brighton. As evening approached, the carnival reached its peak of activity. Electric bulbs strung between the attractions cast pools of warm light against the gathering darkness, while the mechanical music of carousel organs competed with the excited chatter of visitors. Children clutched balloons and sticky sweets while their parents tried various games of chance, hoping to win prizes that ranged from stuffed animals to cheap jewelry. The Hall of Mirrors, the carnival's newest and most popular attraction, drew long queues of eager visitors. The structure was an elaborate maze of glass and chrome, designed by a German engineer named Klaus Weber, who had arrived in England 5 years prior. Inside, visitors would lose themselves among infinite reflections, each turn revealing new distortions and illusions that transformed the familiar into the fantastic. Weber himself stood near the entrance, his tall, thin frame and wire-rimmed spectacles giving him the appearance of a meticulous academic rather than a carnival worker. He watched each visitor enter with obvious pride, occasionally adjusting his glasses as he observed their reactions to his creation. The maze was his masterpiece, he had told Poirot earlier, incorporating principles of psychology and optics that could disorient and delight in equal measure. It was precisely at 8:30 when the scream pierced through the carnival's cheerful cacophony. The sound came from within the Hall of Mirrors, a cry so filled with terror that it silenced the nearby crowd instantly. The mechanical music seemed to falter, and even the distant crash of waves against the pier supports became audible in the sudden hush. Within moments, people began pouring out of the attraction's single entrance, their faces pale with shock and confusion. Some stumbled as they emerged, still disoriented by the maze's effects, while others pushed forward with obvious urgency to escape whatever horror they had witnessed inside. "Murder," gasped Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, a well-dressed woman in her 50s who emerged among the first wave of fleeing visitors. Her usually perfect coiffure was disheveled, and her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. "There's been a murder in there. A man, dead, surrounded by all those terrible mirrors." Poirot pushed through the gathering crowd, his small frame moving with surprising agility. His practiced eye took in every detail, the way people reacted to Mrs. Blackwood's announcement, the expressions of shock and morbid curiosity that played across various faces, the subtle movements that might indicate guilt or knowledge. At the entrance to the Hall of Mirrors, he encountered Mr. Weber, the attraction's designer, who stood wringing his hands in obvious distress. The German's usually precise manner had given way to barely controlled panic, and his accent became more pronounced as his agitation increased. "Mein Gott," Weber muttered, switching between English and his native tongue. "This cannot be happening. Not in my beautiful creation." It was supposed to bring wonder, not horror. Inside the maze, Poirot found the scene that would challenge even his considerable powers of deduction. Following the sounds of voices and the beam of electric torches, he navigated the twisting corridors of mirrors until he reached a circular chamber near the center of the attraction. Here, surrounded by 12 mirrors that created an infinite regression of reflections, lay the body of a man. The victim was well dressed, perhaps 40 years of age, with thinning brown hair and the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to manual labor. His expensive suit was tailored but showed signs of recent stress, wrinkled fabric, a loosened tie, and perspiration stains despite the cool evening air. He had been stabbed through the heart with tremendous force, yet there was no weapon to be found anywhere in the chamber. More puzzling still, there appeared to be no way the killer could have escaped. The chamber had only one entrance, the same route by which Poirot had arrived, and according to witnesses, no one had emerged from the Hall of Mirrors between the time the victim entered and when his body was discovered. "Impossible," muttered Inspector Meadows, the local police officer who had arrived within minutes of the incident. He was a competent man in his 50s, with the kind of methodical approach to investigation that Poirot respected, even if he sometimes found it lacking in imagination. "The man enters alone, dies alone, yet someone else must have killed him. It's like something from a penny dreadful." Poirot knelt beside the body, his practiced eye taking in every detail while being careful not to disturb the scene. The man's wallet identified him as Mr. Reginald Ashworth, age 42, resident of London. His clothes were expensive but showed signs of recent stress, and there was something about his posture, even in death, that suggested a man who had been living under considerable pressure. The chamber's mirrors reflected not only images, but also the growing crowd of officials and curious onlookers who had gathered at the entrance. Each piece of glass showed the scene from a different angle, creating a kaleidoscope of death that somehow held the key to understanding this impossible crime. As the evening wore on, and the carnival's lights began to dim, Poirot remained in the Hall of Mirrors, studying the scene with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The mirrors whispered their secrets in the language of light and shadow, and somewhere in their silent testimony lay the solution to a murder that should not have been possible. The game, as they say, was afoot, and Brighton's seaside carnival would never be quite the same again. Chapter 2: Reflections of the Past. The following morning brought a grey sky that seemed to mirror the somber mood hanging over Brighton Pier. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their harsh cries providing a melancholy soundtrack to the scene below, where police constables stood guard over the now sealed Hall of Mirrors. The carnival had continued operating its other attractions, but the festive atmosphere of the previous evening had been replaced by an air of nervous anticipation. Poirot had taken rooms at the Grand Hotel, where he now sat in the breakfast room, methodically consuming his morning coffee, while his mind turned over the puzzle of the previous evening. His small hands moved with characteristic precision as he arranged the items on his table, cup perfectly aligned with saucer, spoon positioned at exactly the right angle, sugar bowl centered between the milk jug and honey pot. Inspector Meadows joined him, looking haggard after a sleepless night spent trying to make sense of the impossible murder. His usually neat uniform was wrinkled, and dark circles under his eyes testified to the frustration he had experienced. "I've been a policeman for 20 years, he said, settling heavily into the chair opposite Poirot, "and I've never encountered anything like this. How does a man get stabbed to death in a locked room with no weapon and no escape route?" Poirot delicately dabbed his lips with his napkin before responding, his green eyes thoughtful. "The answer, mon ami, lies not in the impossibility of the situation, but in our assumptions about what actually occurred. We must examine not only what we observed, but what we expected to observe. Tell me, what have you learned about our victim, Monsieur Ashworth?" Meadows consulted his notebook, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of a methodical investigator. Reginald Ashworth was a businessman from London, owned several properties, mostly boarding houses and small hotels in the less fashionable districts. Came to Brighton 3 days ago, staying at the Albion Hotel under his own name. No apparent connection to the carnival or anyone associated with it. No apparent connection, Poirot repeated thoughtfully, stirring his coffee with deliberate movements. But appearances, they can be most deceiving, can they not? What of his behavior yesterday? Did anyone observe anything unusual? That's where it gets interesting. Meadows turned several pages in his notebook. According to the hotel staff, Ashworth seemed nervous, agitated. He received several telephone calls that clearly upset him. The desk clerk said he looked like a man being hunted, kept checking over his shoulder, jumping at unexpected sounds. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Hunted. A most evocative word, Inspector. And what of the carnival people? Surely we must examine their backgrounds as well. Meadows flipped through several more pages, each filled with detailed notes and observations. Geoffrey Hartwell owns the carnival. He's a widower, been running traveling shows for 15 years since his wife died. Built the business up from nothing, apparently. His son Timothy helps with the operation. Bright lad, about 20, handles much of the administrative work. Then there's Klaus Weber, who designed the Hall of Mirrors and oversees its operation. German national, came to England 5 years ago with impressive credentials in engineering and optics. And the witnesses from yesterday evening, Mrs. Blackwood claims to be writing a book about seaside entertainments. She's been following the carnival for the past week, taking notes and photographs. Says she's particularly interested in the psychological effects of carnival attractions on visitors. Then there's the young couple, the Ventners, local honeymoon couple. Ernest Ventnor works as a clerk at a Brighton bank, married his sweetheart Dorothy just last month. They were at the carnival celebrating their honeymoon. Poirot finished his coffee and rose from the table, his movements as precise and economical as always. I think, Inspector, it is time we paid a visit to this Hall of Mirrors in the cold light of day. Illusions that seem magical in the evening often reveal their mechanical nature when examined by daylight. The carnival grounds looked shabby and tired without the concealing glamour of electric lights. Paint peeled from the wooden facades, and the smell of grease and sawdust hung in the morning air like yesterday's dreams. The Hall of Mirrors stood at the far end of the pier, its chrome and glass exterior reflecting the grey sky like a melancholy kaleidoscope. Klaus Weber met them at the entrance, his face drawn with worry and exhaustion. He was a tall, thin man with precise movements and wire-rimmed spectacles that magnified his pale blue eyes. His usual meticulous appearance showed signs of strain. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Gentlemen, please, you understand this is a disaster for me," Weber said, his German accent becoming more pronounced in his distress. "My reputation, my life's work, all ruined by this terrible business. I have spent years perfecting the psychological and optical principles that make this attraction unique." "Your concern is understandable, Monsieur Weber," Poirot replied diplomatically. "But perhaps you can help us understand exactly how your creation functions. The mirrors, they are positioned according to what principle?" Weber's face brightened slightly as he warmed to his subject, his professional pride temporarily overcoming his anxiety. Yes, it is quite ingenious, if I may say so. Each mirror is angled precisely to create specific optical effects. The maze is designed to disorient visitors gradually, building to the central chamber where all the illusions converge. A person standing in the center sees himself reflected infinitely in all directions. It can be quite overwhelming, psychologically speaking. They entered the maze, following the predetermined path that led visitors through various chambers of distorted reflections. Some mirrors stretched visitors tall and thin, others compressed them into grotesque shapes, and still others created multiple overlapping images that seemed to move independently. The effect was disorienting even in daylight, and Poirot could easily imagine how overwhelming it might be in the dramatic lighting of evening. "Here," Weber said as they reached the central chamber, his voice dropping to a whisper, "this is where we found him. Where that poor man met his terrible end." The chamber was circular, about 12 feet in diameter, with mirrors positioned around the walls at carefully calculated angles. The floor was polished hardwood, now marred by chalk outlines showing where Ashworth's body had lain. Even without the dramatic lighting of the previous evening, the space felt charged with menace, as if the mirrors themselves retained some memory of the violence they had witnessed. Poirot walked slowly around the perimeter, studying each mirror carefully. His green eyes moved methodically from surface to surface, taking in not only the reflections but the mechanisms that created them. "Tell me, Monsieur Weber, once a person enters this chamber, there is only one way out, the way they came in." Weber nodded emphatically, his hands gesturing to emphasize his point. "Exactly, the chamber is the end point of the maze. Visitors must return the way they came to exit the attraction. There are no hidden passages, no secret doors. It is, as you English say, a dead end. And you are certain that no one left the chamber between the time Monsieur Ashworth entered and when his body was discovered?" Weber's face grew pale behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "I was watching the entrance the entire time, as I always do. It is part of my responsibility to monitor visitor flow and ensure safety. No one came out. No one could have come out." Poirot paused before one particular mirror, his head tilted at a characteristic angle. In the glass, multiple reflections of the little detective stretched away into infinity, each one appearing to ponder the same impossible puzzle. The sight was hypnotic, and for a moment, Poirot felt he could almost grasp the solution. It hovered just beyond conscious thought, like a reflection glimpsed at the edge of vision. As they prepared to leave the Hall of Mirrors, Poirot turned back for one final look at the central chamber. Something about the scene nagged at him, some detail that his subconscious had noticed but his rational mind had not yet processed. The answer was there, hidden among the reflections and illusions, waiting for the right perspective to reveal itself. The mirrors held their secrets close, but Poirot was confident that patience and careful observation would eventually unlock their mysteries. In his experience, the most impossible crimes often had the simplest solutions. It was simply a matter of looking at them from the correct angle. Chapter 3. The Businessman's Burden. After their examination of the Hall of Mirrors, Poirot suggested they visit the Albion Hotel to learn more about the victim's final days. The walk through Brighton's narrow streets provided an opportunity to observe the town's character, a mixture of Victorian respectability and modern seaside commerce that created its own unique atmosphere. The hotel was a modest establishment on a side street near the seafront, catering to middle-class visitors who sought comfort without extravagance. Its brick facade was well maintained but unremarkable, and the small lobby displayed the kind of functional elegance that suggested solid management rather than luxury. The desk clerk, a nervous young man named Phillips who couldn't have been more than 25, remembered Ashworth clearly. His pale complexion and darting eyes suggested someone unaccustomed to dealing with police investigations, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. A gentleman, yes, very well dressed, but he seemed troubled about something. Phillips explained, adjusting his collar nervously. Kept looking over his shoulder, if you know what I mean. Always seemed to be expecting someone, but not someone he wanted to see. And those telephone calls, they came at all hours, day and night. You could hear these conversations? Poirot inquired, his tone carefully neutral to avoid seeming accusatory. Phillips flushed slightly. "Well, not to listen deliberately, you understand, but the walls are rather thin in these older buildings," and his voice would rise when he became agitated. I couldn't help but overhear fragments of what he was saying. I heard him say things like, "You can't prove anything," and that was years ago. It has nothing to do with now. Most distressing, really. Inspector Meadows made careful notes as Philip spoke. "Did he receive any visitors during his stay?" "Not that I saw, sir. He kept very much to himself, except for those telephone calls. But he did go out frequently, often for hours at a time. Never said where he was going, but he always looked worried when he left, and even more worried when he returned." In Ashworth's room on the second floor, they found the belongings of a man who had travelled light but lived well. His suitcase contained expensive clothing, silk shirts, hand-tailored suits, a cashmere overcoat that must have cost more than Phillips earned in 6 months. There was also a gold pocket watch engraved with the initials Ray, and a date from 15 years prior, and a leather portfolio filled with business documents. Poirot examined each item carefully, his methodical nature revealing details that would escape a casual observer. The clothes were well made but showed signs of stress, wrinkles that suggested restless nights, stains that indicated hasty meals, wear patterns that spoke of a man who had been living under considerable pressure. Interesting, he murmured, holding up a train ticket stub that had been tucked into the pocket of Ashworth's waistcoat. Monsieur Ashworth arrived in Brighton not 3 days ago, as the police initially believed, but 5 days ago. He spent 2 days here before registering at this hotel. The question is, where was he during those missing days? Inspector Meadows frowned, his methodical mind trying to piece together the timeline. Could he have been staying elsewhere in Brighton? Perhaps under a false name. Possible, but unlikely, Poirot replied, examining the ticket stub more closely. A man of his apparent means would not choose inferior accommodations without good reason. The dates on this ticket suggest he came here directly from London on a specific day, with a specific purpose. None. I think he was here in Brighton, but did not wish his presence to be officially recorded. In the portfolio they discovered documents that shed considerable light on Ashworth's business dealings. The papers revealed a man who owned several properties in London's less fashionable districts, boarding houses that catered to transient workers, immigrants, and others who had few choices in accommodation. The paperwork suggested a businessman who was successful, but not necessarily scrupulous about his methods. The rental agreements showed cramped conditions, high occupancy rates, and minimal maintenance expenses. There were also several letters from tenants complaining about poor conditions, lack of heat, inadequate sanitation, and other issues that Ashworth had apparently ignored. His responses, when there were any, were dismissive and occasionally threatening. "Look at this," Inspector Meadows said, holding up a letter dated 2 weeks prior to Ashworth's death. The handwriting was educated, but deliberately disguised, and the tone was ominous. Someone was threatening to expose what they call certain irregular practices in his business dealings. The letter demands a meeting, and is signed only with the initial N. Poirot studied the letter carefully, noting not only its contents but the quality of the paper, the style of the handwriting, and the particular phrases used. Our anonymous correspondent was careful to leave no identifying traces, yet the very care suggests this was not the work of a common blackmailer, but someone with much to lose if discovered. The letter's language was formal, almost legal in its precision, and it referenced specific incidents and dates that suggested intimate knowledge of Ashworth's business practices. The threats were veiled but unmistakable: exposure that could lead to criminal charges, financial ruin, and social disgrace. They were interrupted by a knock at the door. Phillips stood in the hallway looking even more nervous than before, wringing his hands as he spoke. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but there's a lady downstairs asking about Mr. Ashworth. Says she's his sister, come down from London when she heard the news in the papers." The woman waiting in the hotel lobby was perhaps 35 years old, dressed in appropriate mourning black, with the kind of composed bearing that suggested strength beneath her obvious grief. Her features bore a resemblance to the deceased man, but refined and softened by what appeared to be a gentler nature. She introduced herself as Miss Catherine Ashworth, and confirmed that she had indeed travelled from London upon learning of her brother's death, through a brief newspaper account. "Reginald was a good man, despite what people might say about his business methods," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He worked hard to build something from nothing after our parents died. Our father was a clerk who left us very little, and our mother passed away when I was still quite young. Reginald sacrificed his own education to ensure I could attend a proper school and make something of myself." "Did your brother have enemies, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently, his tone conveying sympathy while seeking information. She hesitated before answering, clearly weighing her words carefully. "He was not always diplomatic in his business dealings. Some of his tenants complained about conditions in his properties, but Reginald said that was simply the reality of providing affordable housing to those who couldn't afford better. He said people didn't appreciate how difficult it was to maintain old buildings on limited rental income, and recently, had he seemed worried or troubled about anything in particular?" Catherine Ashworth's composed facade cracked slightly. "Yes, actually, for the past month or so he'd been receiving letters that upset him greatly. He wouldn't tell me what they contained, but I could see they were weighing on his mind terribly. He'd grown thin, wasn't sleeping well, and had developed a nervous habit of constantly checking over his shoulder.
Poirot leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. Did he ever mention Brighton, or a carnival, or anyone associated with such enterprises? Catherine shook her head decisively. No, never. I was quite surprised when I learned he'd come here. Reginald wasn't the sort for seaside holidays. He considered such things frivolous. He was far too serious and focused on business for such entertainments. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Poirot paused to examine the guest register more carefully. His keen eyes spotted something that Inspector Meadows had missed, an entry from exactly 1 week prior to Ashworth's arrival. The name was almost illegible, due to poor penmanship, but the signature was unmistakably that of Klaus Weber, the German engineer, who had designed the Hall of Mirrors. Most curious, Poirot murmured, pointing out the entry to Inspector Meadows. It appears our precise engineer has not been entirely forthcoming about his connections to the victim. The question now becomes what brought these two men together in Brighton, and why did Weber fail to mention their prior meeting? The web of connections was growing more complex, and Poirot sensed that the true motive for murder lay somewhere in the tangled relationships between the various players in this seaside drama. Chapter 4. Secrets Behind the Glass. That afternoon, Poirot decided to interview the carnival workers individually, beginning with Timothy Hartwell, the owner's son. The young man had agreed to meet them in the small office caravan that served as the carnival's administrative headquarters, a cluttered space that revealed the complex logistics required to keep a traveling show operational. The caravan was cramped but efficiently organized, with ledgers stacked on makeshift shelves, receipts impaled on metal spikes, and promotional materials for various attractions covering every available wall surface. A small desk dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with maps showing potential routes through England's seaside towns. Timothy was an earnest young man of perhaps 22, with ink-stained fingers and the slightly overwhelmed look of someone thrust into responsibilities beyond his years. His resemblance to his father was unmistakable, but where Geoffrey Hartwell had the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years in outdoor work, Timothy retained the pale complexion of someone more comfortable with books and ledgers than manual labor. I've been helping father since mother died 3 years ago, Timothy explained, settling behind the desk with the careful manner of someone conscious of his youth and inexperience. It's not easy keeping a traveling carnival profitable these days. People have more entertainment options now, cinemas, wireless programs, motor trips to the countryside. We have to work much harder to draw crowds than we did even 5 years ago. You were working as a guide in the Hall of Mirrors yesterday evening, Poirot observed, consulting his own small notebook. Tell me exactly what you witnessed, in as much detail as you can remember. Timothy consulted a small ledger he pulled from his pocket, its pages filled with careful notations in his neat handwriting. I try to keep track of visitor flow throughout the evening, helps prevent overcrowding in the maze which can be dangerous. At approximately 8:20, I saw Mr. Ashworth approach the entrance. He seemed agitated, kept checking his pocket watch, and looking around as if he were waiting for someone. Did he speak to you? Only to ask if the attraction would be closing soon. I told him we stayed open until 10 o'clock on busy evenings like yesterday. He nodded and purchased his ticket, but he seemed reluctant to enter immediately. He stood near the entrance for several minutes, still checking his watch. And Mrs. Blackwood? Timothy flipped through several pages of his notebook. She entered just ahead of him, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes earlier. She'd been observing the attraction from a distance for most of the evening, taking notes in a small book she carried. Very methodical about it. She reminded me of a scientist studying specimens. The Ventnor couple. They followed about 5 minutes after Mr. Ashworth went in. Nice young people, obviously very much in love. The husband was being very protective of his wife, warning her about the disorienting effects of the mirrors, and offering to turn back if she found it too disturbing. Poirot made careful notes as Timothy spoke. During the time between Mr. Ashworth's entry and the discovery of his body, did anyone else enter or exit the Hall of Mirrors? Timothy shook his head firmly, his certainty absolute. No one. I was stationed right at the entrance the entire time, taking tickets and providing warnings about the attraction's effects. When Mrs. Blackwood screamed, people started rushing out in panic, but before that moment, absolutely no one had emerged.
After finishing with Timothy, Poirot sought out Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, He found her at a small cafe near the pier, where she was taking afternoon tea with the careful precision of someone for whom proper social rituals provided comfort in times of distress. The cafe was nearly empty, its few patrons speaking in hushed tones about the previous evening's events. Mrs. Blackwood was a handsome woman in her early 50s, well dressed in the manner of someone with modest means but impeccable taste. Her dark hair was streaked with distinguished silver, pulled back in a style that emphasized her intelligent brown eyes and strong jawline. Despite the obvious stress of recent events, she maintained the composure of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. "I've been quite shaken by the whole affair," she admitted, as Poirot joined her at a small table near the window. "I came to Brighton to research my book on seaside entertainments, but I never expected to become involved in such a terrible business. I've covered many aspects of popular culture in my previous work, but nothing quite like this." "You mentioned you are writing a book." "Yes, about the cultural significance of carnival attractions and their role in working-class entertainment," she explained, her voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone discussing a passion project. "The Hall of Mirrors particularly interested me from an anthropological perspective. The way people react to distorted reflections of themselves reveals quite a lot about human psychology and self-perception." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, genuinely interested in her academic perspective. "And your observations of Mr. Ashworth yesterday evening?" Mrs. Blackwood set down her teacup carefully, her movements precise and considered. "He was clearly agitated about something from the moment I first noticed him. When I first saw him, he was standing near the entrance to the maze, apparently waiting for someone. He kept checking his watch and looking around anxiously, as if he had an appointment he was dreading." "Waiting for someone, you are certain of this impression?" "Quite certain. I've spent years observing human behavior for my research, and he had all the classic signs of someone keeping an appointment he would rather avoid. When he finally entered the maze, it was with obvious reluctance, as if he were forcing himself to go through with something unpleasant." "Did you observe him speaking to anyone before entering the maze?" Mrs. Blackwood paused, considering the question carefully. "Not directly speaking, no, but I did notice him exchange glances with that German gentleman, Mr. Weber. There was something almost like recognition in their behavior, though they didn't actually speak. It was the kind of look that passes between people who know each other, but prefer not to acknowledge the fact publicly." This confirmed Poirot's growing suspicion about the connection between Weber and Ashworth. The guest register at the Albion Hotel had already suggested a prior meeting, and now Mrs. Blackwood's observations provided additional evidence that the two men had more history than Weber had admitted. As the afternoon wore on, Poirot made arrangements to interview the German engineer that evening, after the carnival closed to the public. He spent the remaining daylight hours walking along Brighton's seafront, allowing his mind to process the accumulating evidence while observing the town's rhythm and character. The meeting with Weber took place in his workshop, a cluttered space behind the Hall of Mirrors filled with mirror fragments, precision measuring tools, and technical drawings that revealed the mathematical complexity behind the attraction's seemingly simple effects. Weber seemed more nervous than he had earlier, his precise movements betraying an underlying tension that suggested he was preparing for a difficult conversation. "I must ask you directly, Monsieur Weber," Poirot began, settling into a wooden chair across from the engineer's workbench, "about your previous relationship with the victim." Weber's face paled behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and he began cleaning them with shaking hands, a nervous gesture that Poirot had observed in him before. "I'm not sure what you mean by that." "Come now, monsieur. We have discovered that you were a guest at the same hotel where Ashworth was staying just 1 week ago. We also have witness testimony that you and the victim exchanged meaningful glances yesterday evening. This cannot be mere coincidence, particularly given your initial claims of having no connection to the man." Weber sat down heavily in his chair, removing his glasses completely to reveal pale blue eyes that seemed naked and vulnerable without their protective lenses. "Very well. Yes, I knew Reginald Ashworth. We met 5 years ago, when I first came to England after the war. He helped me find my first lodgings in London, at one of his properties. Yes, a boarding house in Whitechapel. The conditions were, Webber paused, choosing his words carefully while replacing his glasses with trembling hands. They were not as represented in the advertisement. Overcrowded, unsanitary, with heating that barely functioned even in the coldest weather. When I complained, Ashworth made it clear that foreigners who caused trouble might find themselves reported to the authorities as undesirable aliens subject to deportation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern in Poirot's mind, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. Each new revelation added another layer of complexity to what had initially seemed like a straightforward if impossible murder case. Webber's story provided another motive for murder, but like the other testimonies Poirot had gathered, it still didn't explain the mechanical details of how the crime had been committed. The mystery of the locked room, the missing weapon, and the impossible escape remained as puzzling as ever. As evening approached and the carnival prepared for another night of operation, Poirot sensed that he was approaching the heart of the mystery. The various threads of motive, opportunity and means were beginning to weave together, but the final pattern remained just beyond his comprehension. Chapter 5: The Honeymooner's Tale. The next morning brought unexpected sunshine to Brighton, transforming the grey seaside town into something approaching the cheerful holiday destination it aspired to be. Golden light sparkled on the waves and painted the pier's Victorian ironwork in warm hues that made even the carnival's shabby attractions appear magical once again. Poirot had arranged to meet the Ventnor couple at their modest lodgings on a quiet residential street near the town centre. The address Timothy Hartwell had provided led to a narrow terraced house that had been converted into holiday apartments, the kind of respectable but inexpensive accommodation that attracted young couples on limited budgets. Ernest and Dorothy Ventnor were newlyweds in the truest sense. Their happiness and devotion to each other was evident in every glance and gesture, creating an atmosphere of such innocent joy that it seemed almost incongruous with the dark circumstances that had brought them together. Their small sitting room was bright and cheerful, decorated with fresh flowers and wedding photographs that told the story of their recent ceremony. Ernest was a slight, earnest young man with prematurely thinning hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling other people's money with scrupulous attention to detail. His clothes were modest but well maintained, and he possessed the kind of quiet dignity that came from honest work and simple ambitions. Dorothy was pretty in an understated way, with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to light up whenever she looked at her husband. "We're still quite shaken by what happened," Dorothy admitted as she served tea in their small sitting room, her hands trembling slightly as she poured from the modest china service. "One moment we were enjoying the carnival like any other young couple on holiday, and the next there was that terrible scream echoing through those mirrors. The whole experience has been quite overwhelming," Ernest added, accepting his cup with the careful politeness of someone determined to maintain proper social forms even under stress. "We'd saved for months for this holiday, and to have it marred by such a horrible incident, well, it's not something we'll ever forget." "Tell me about your experience in the Hall of Mirrors," Poirot requested, settling comfortably into his chair and producing his small leather notebook. "Every detail, however insignificant it might seem to you, could prove crucial to understanding what happened." Ernest consulted a small diary he kept meticulously, its pages filled with careful notations about their honeymoon activities. "We entered at approximately 8:25. I remember checking my watch because Dorothy was concerned about the time. We had dinner reservations at 9 o'clock at a restaurant that had been recommended by the landlady here. We were moving through the maze quite slowly," Dorothy added, her voice soft but clear. "It was our first time in such an attraction, and we found it rather disorienting. The mirrors seemed to stretch on forever, and I kept losing my sense of direction. Ernest had to steady me several times when I became dizzy from all the reflections." Ernest nodded, his protective instincts clearly evident even in recounting the experience. "I was worried the effects might be too much for Dorothy. Some of the mirrors made us appear quite grotesque, and the constant shifting of perspective was rather overwhelming. We considered turning back more than once." "And Mr. Ashworth, when did you first encounter him within the maze?" The couple exchanged puzzled glances before Ernest responded. "That's the strange thing, Mr. Poirot. We never actually saw him alive inside the maze. We knew he had entered ahead of us because the young man at the entrance, Timothy Hartwell, told us so when we purchased our tickets. But despite moving quite slowly through the attraction, we never caught up with him. Dorothy nodded in agreement, her brown eyes reflecting the confusion she still felt. The maze is quite long and complex, with many branching paths, and we were taking our time, stopping frequently to examine the different mirror effects. Ernest was being very patient with me, explaining the optical principles behind each illusion. When we reached the central chamber, we found Dorothy shuddered and couldn't finish the sentence, the memory clearly still traumatic, despite the passage of time. The poor man was already dead when you arrived. Yes, Ernest confirmed, his voice heavy with the weight of the discovery. Mrs. Blackwood was standing over the body, screaming in the most horrible way. The sound echoed off all those mirrors until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. We immediately rushed out to get help, though I'm afraid Dorothy was quite overcome by the shock. Poirot made careful notes as they spoke, his pen moving with the same methodical precision that characterized all his actions. During your progress through the maze, did you hear anything unusual? Voices perhaps, or sounds of a struggle? The couple exchanged another glance, this one suggesting they had discussed this very question between themselves. Now that you mention it, Dorothy said slowly, her brow furrowed in concentration, there was something. Just before we reached the final chamber, we heard what sounded like a heated conversation, voices raised in anger, though we couldn't make out the actual words. The mirrors seemed to distort sound as well as sight, Ernest explained. Voices echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. It was quite disorienting, and we weren't even certain the voices were real at first. How many voices did you hear? Ernest considered the question carefully, his methodical nature evident in his deliberate response. 2, I believe. Both men's voices, though the acoustic effects made it difficult to be certain. One seemed to be pleading or arguing, while the other was more aggressive in tone. Could you distinguish any words or phrases? Dorothy shook her head regretfully. The echoing effect made everything unclear. We heard the emotion in the voices, anger, fear, desperation, but not the specific content of what was being said. This was crucial information that contradicted the apparent impossibility of the crime. If there had been 2 men in the central chamber engaged in heated conversation, where had the second one gone? The chamber had only one entrance, and according to Timothy Hartwell's careful observations, no one had emerged between Ashworth's entry and the discovery of his body. After leaving the Ventnors, Poirot walked slowly along the seafront, his mind working through the accumulating evidence like a jeweler examining a complex mechanism. The case was becoming clearer in some respects while growing more puzzling in others. Each new piece of testimony added depth to the picture, but the central mystery remained: how had the killer escaped from what appeared to be an impossible situation? His contemplation was interrupted by Timothy Hartwell, who approached him with obvious urgency. The young man's usual composure was shattered, and his face bore the pale, shocked expression of someone who had discovered something deeply disturbing. "Mr. Poirot, thank goodness I found you," Timothy said, slightly out of breath from what appeared to have been a hurried search. "Something terrible has happened. Someone broke into our caravan last night." Father's beside himself with worry, they hurried back to the carnival grounds, where Geoffrey Hartwell was surveying the damage to his office with the grim expression of a man facing potential ruin. Papers were scattered everywhere, filing cabinets had been forced open with crowbars or similar tools, and a small safe in the corner showed obvious signs of attempted entry, though it appeared to have resisted the burglar's efforts. "Professional job," Hartwell observed grimly, his experienced eye taking in the systematic nature of the destruction. Whoever did this was looking for something specific. They weren't interested in the day's receipts, those were left untouched in the cash box. "But all my personal papers have been rifled through, examined and scattered." "What sort of personal papers?" Poirot inquired, kneeling to examine some of the scattered documents more closely. "Old correspondence, business records going back years, employee files, contracts with various towns and venues. Nothing that would interest an ordinary thief looking for quick profit." Poirot examined the scene carefully, noting the systematic nature of the search.
Drawers had been opened in sequence, files examined methodically, and papers sorted through with obvious purpose. This was not random vandalism or opportunistic theft, but a deliberate attempt to find something specific, or perhaps to destroy evidence that might prove incriminating. Mr. Hartwell, Poirot said suddenly, rising from his examination of the scattered papers, I must ask you directly, did you know Reginald Ashworth before this week? The carnival owner's face grew pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he attempted to gather some of the scattered documents. What makes you think? Come now, monsieur, someone broke into your caravan searching for evidence of a connection to the victim. The systematic nature of this search suggests they knew exactly what they were looking for. It would be best if you told me the truth now, before it emerges through other means. Geoffrey Hartwell sat down heavily in his overturned chair, suddenly looking every one of his 50-odd years. Yes, I knew him. It was years ago, during the war. We served in the same regiment in France, the Royal Sussex, stationed near Arras. I thought I'd never see him again when we were demobilized in 1919, but you did see him again. Hartwell's shoulders sagged with the weight of confession. 3 weeks ago he turned up at our show in Margate. Said he'd been following our route through the newspaper advertisements. He claimed he just wanted to reminisce about old times, talk about the men we'd served with, but I could tell there was something else. There was something in his manner, something calculating. What did he want, Mr. Hartwell? The older man's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Money, £500 to be exact. He said he knew things about what happened during the war, things that could ruin me if they came out, things that could see me prosecuted for crimes committed during wartime. The motive for murder was becoming clear, but the method remained as mysterious as ever. Poirot sensed he was approaching the truth, but the final pieces of the puzzle continued to elude his grasp. Chapter 6. Mirrors and Memories. That evening, as the carnival prepared for another night of entertainment, Poirot requested a private demonstration of the Hall of Mirrors. The attraction had been closed to the public since the murder, allowing the police to complete their investigation, but Klaus Weber reluctantly agreed to guide Poirot and Inspector Meadows through the maze after the rest of the carnival had shut down for the night. The pier felt different in the darkness, with only scattered electric lights providing illumination against the vast black expanse of the English Channel. The sounds of the sea seemed louder without the carnival's usual cacophony, and the wind carried salt spray that made everything feel damp and slightly ominous. The design is based on principles I learned studying with Professor Muller in Berlin before the war, Weber explained as they approached the entrance to his creation. His voice carried a note of professional pride that temporarily overcame his obvious nervousness about revisiting the scene of the crime. The attraction was eerily different in the dim emergency lighting that had been installed for their visit. Without the dramatic illumination and the excitement of other visitors, the maze felt claustrophobic and menacing. Shadows played tricks with the eye, and their footsteps echoed strangely among the mirrors, creating an unsettling symphony of reflected sound. Each mirror is positioned to create specific psychological effects on the visitor, Weber continued as they navigated the twisting corridors. The early chambers are designed to amuse and intrigue, but as visitors progress deeper into the maze, the effects become more disorienting, more psychologically challenging. The mirrors around them created an infinite regression of reflections, each one slightly different as the angles and lighting changed. Poirot found himself studying not just the immediate reflections but the way they interacted with each other, creating complex patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and change with every movement. Tell me, Monsieur Weber, Poirot said as they walked deeper into the maze, about your arrangement with Mr. Ashworth regarding your lodgings in London. I sense there is more to this story than you have previously shared. Weber stopped walking abruptly, his reflection multiplying infinitely in the surrounding mirrors. The effect was disconcerting, dozens of nervous German engineers stretching away into optical infinity, each one adjusting his glasses with shaking hands. I told you already, he was my landlord. The conditions were poor, but I had little choice in the matter. As a foreign national with limited resources, I was grateful for any accommodation. But surely there is more to the story. A man does not travel from London to Brighton simply to reminisce about unsatisfactory accommodations, particularly when that man is facing financial pressures of his own. For a long moment, Weather said nothing, his breathing audible in the enclosed space. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and his words seemed to echo endlessly among the mirrors. During the war, I was interned as an enemy alien on the Isle of Man. The conditions were harsh. We were treated as criminals rather than civilians caught in circumstances beyond our control. When I was finally released in 1920, I had nothing, no money, no connections, no way to rebuild my life in a country that viewed me with suspicion. And Mr. Ashworth offered assistance. Weather's laugh was bitter, echoing strangely in the mirrored space. He offered work, maintenance duties at his properties, repair work that required technical knowledge but paid barely enough to survive. It seemed like salvation at first, but it became another form of prison. They had been walking steadily deeper into the maze as Weather spoke, and now they reached the central chamber where Ashworth had died. In the dim emergency lighting, the circular space felt oppressive rather than spectacular, and the mirrors created an unsettling kaleidoscope of shadows and distorted reflections. The work was dangerous, repairing gas lines, electrical systems, structural problems that should have been handled by licensed professionals. Weather continued, his voice growing stronger as he unburdened himself of years of resentment. When I tried to leave, to find better employment elsewhere, he threatened to have me deported as an undesirable alien. He said he had connections with the immigration authorities. Inspector Meadows stepped forward, his professional instincts engaged. "Are you confessing to murder, Mr. Weather?" "No," Weather exclaimed, his voice echoing dramatically off the surrounding mirrors. "I did not kill him. Yes, we met here that night, and yes, we argued. He had appeared at the carnival 3 days earlier, demanding money, threatening to destroy everything I had built here if I didn't help him." "Help him how?" Weather removed his glasses and began cleaning them nervously, a gesture that Poirot now recognized as his characteristic response to stress. "He wanted me to provide him with alibis, to swear that certain incidents at his properties were accidents rather than negligence. There had been a fire at one of his buildings, a young woman died because the fire escape had been blocked. He wanted me to testify that I had inspected the building and found it safe. And you refused." "Of course I refused. I am an engineer. My reputation, my professional integrity is everything." When I told him I would not perjure myself to save his reputation, he became angry, threatening. He said he would destroy me just as he had destroyed others who crossed him. "But how did he die, Monsieur Weather? What exactly happened in this chamber?" Weather replaced his glasses and looked around the circular space, his eyes reflecting the fear and confusion he had felt that night. "I honestly don't know. We were arguing, he was shouting, making wild threats, when suddenly he clutched his chest and fell forward. I thought perhaps it was his heart, but then I saw the blood spreading across his shirt, and the knife. There was no knife, at least none that I saw. I panicked when I realized he was dead, and I used the exit I had prepared for maintenance purposes." Weather led them to what appeared to be a solid mirror on the far side of the chamber. But when he pressed a hidden mechanism concealed behind the mirror's frame, the entire panel swung open like a door, revealing a narrow passage that led to the workshop behind the attraction. "I built this for practical reasons," Weather explained, demonstrating the mechanism. "It allows access to the central chamber for cleaning and maintenance without requiring workers to navigate the entire maze carrying equipment." Poirot examined the hidden door carefully, noting the ingenious design that made it virtually invisible when closed. The mechanism was sophisticated, operating silently and requiring knowledge of its exact location to activate. It explained how someone could have escaped from what appeared to be an impossible situation. "So you left through this passage after finding Mr. Ashworth's body?" Weather nodded miserably. "I thought if I could slip away unseen no one would know I had been there. I knew my history with Ashworth would make me a suspect, and as a foreign national, I feared I would not receive fair treatment from the authorities." The revelation of the secret passage solved one aspect of the mystery, but it raised new questions that were perhaps even more troubling. If Weather was telling the truth about finding Ashworth already stabbed, then someone else had been in the chamber, someone who had managed to escape even more mysteriously than Weather himself. As they made their way back through the maze, Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities. The hidden door explained how the killer could have escaped, but it didn't explain the missing murder weapon, or identify who had actually committed the crime. The solution to the puzzle lay somewhere in the reflections that surrounded them, in the interplay of truth and illusion that defined both the Hall of Mirrors and the case itself. They emerged from the maze into the cool night air, where the sounds of the sea provided a stark contrast to the claustrophobic atmosphere they had just left. The carnival sat silent around them, its attractions looming like sleeping giants in the darkness. Poirot could feel the answer hovering just beyond his grasp, like a reflection that disappeared when looked at directly. The mirrors had shown them many things, but they had yet to reveal their most important secret, the identity of a killer who had used illusion itself as both weapon and alibi. The game was approaching its climax, and somewhere in the accumulated evidence lay the key to understanding not just how Reginald Ashworth had died, but why his death had been orchestrated in such an elaborate and theatrical manner. Chapter 7. The Art of Misdirection. The following morning brought a breakthrough in the case, though not in the way Poirot had expected. Mrs. Blackwood appeared at his hotel room door at an unusually early hour, her usual composure replaced by obvious agitation that suggested she had spent a sleepless night wrestling with her conscience. "Mr. Poirot, I must speak with you urgently," she said, accepting his invitation to enter the elegantly appointed sitting room. "I'm afraid I haven't been entirely truthful about my reasons for being in Brighton, and given the seriousness of what has happened, I can no longer keep silent." She settled into the chair by the window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap in a gesture that suggested she was preparing to reveal something significant. The morning light revealed lines of strain around her eyes that hadn't been visible during their previous conversations, and her usually perfect grooming showed signs of distress. "I told you I was researching a book about carnival attractions, and that's true as far as it goes," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious stress she was experiencing. "But there's considerably more to the story than I initially revealed." Poirot poured himself a cup of coffee from the service on his desk, his movements deliberate and calming. The familiar ritual seemed to provide comfort to Mrs. Blackwood as well, who visibly relaxed as she watched his precise, methodical actions. "Please, madame, tell me everything. I sense this revelation may be crucial to understanding what happened to Mr. Ashworth." Mrs. Blackwood took a deep breath before continuing. "My real name is Henrietta Ashworth. Reginald was my late husband's cousin, though we had lost touch years ago, following a bitter family dispute over inheritance matters." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The connection explained several things that had puzzled him about Mrs. Blackwood's behavior and knowledge of the victim. "Recently, I've been investigating his business practices," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she unburdened herself of the secret she had been carrying. "Not for personal reasons, but because of the suffering he was causing to innocent people." "For what specific purpose were you conducting this investigation?" Mrs. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly, revealing the anger and determination that had motivated her actions. "My nephew, Reginald's sister Catherine's son, had been living in one of his properties in London. The boy is only 19, trying to make his way as a clerk while studying accounting in the evenings. The conditions in that boarding house were appalling, overcrowded, unsanitary, with heating that barely functioned even in the depths of winter." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing with obvious difficulty. "When the boy became seriously ill with tuberculosis, the family doctor said the poor living conditions had certainly contributed to his condition. Catherine was too proud to ask for help directly, but I felt someone needed to hold Reginald accountable for the suffering he was causing." "You were blackmailing him?"
Mrs. Blackwood flinched at the word, though she didn't deny the accusation. "I prefer to think of it as seeking justice through the only means available. I had documented evidence of health code violations, illegal overcrowding, fire safety violations, and other practices that could have resulted in serious legal consequences. I simply wanted him to improve conditions for his tenants and provide compensation for my nephew's medical expenses. And he agreed to meet you at the carnival, reluctantly. The meetings were his idea, actually. He suggested Brighton as a location where we would be less likely to be recognized by his business associates or social connections. He was very concerned about maintaining his reputation in London society." Poirot made careful notes as she spoke, fitting this new information into the complex pattern of motives and relationships he had been constructing. "Tell me exactly what transpired during your meeting on the evening of his death." Mrs. Blackwood's face grew pale as she recalled the events. We met at the entrance to the Hall of Mirrors at 8:15 as arranged. He was already agitated when I arrived, muttering about other people making demands on him, and saying he couldn't possibly satisfy everyone who was pressuring him. Other people. He didn't elaborate, but he seemed to be under considerable stress from multiple sources. When I showed him the photographs I'd taken of conditions at his properties, terrible images of overcrowded rooms, broken plumbing, structural damage, he became quite angry, and then he stormed into the maze saying he needed time to think about my demands. I followed, hoping to continue our conversation and reach some kind of agreement. But those mirrors were so disorienting that I soon lost track of him in the maze. Mrs. Blackwood shuddered slightly as she recalled the experience. The reflections seemed to stretch on forever, and every turn led to more mirrors. I found myself going in circles, becoming increasingly frustrated and disoriented. You never reached the central chamber together. She shook her head definitively. No, we became separated almost immediately after entering the maze. It wasn't until I heard voices raised in anger that I was able to follow the sound to the central chamber. Voices plural, yes, definitely two men arguing. One was clearly Reginald. I recognized his voice even distorted by the acoustics of that place, but I didn't recognize the other voice, though something about it seemed familiar. This corroborated the vintner's testimony about hearing an argument, but it still didn't identify the second participant or explain how that person had managed to escape from the seemingly impossible situation. By the time I found the chamber, however, Reginald was alone, and she trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. Poirot decided it was time to confront the other suspects with what he had learned. The web of connections was growing more complex, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. Each person who had been at the carnival that evening had their own relationship with the victim, their own motive for wanting him dead. He found Geoffrey Hartwell in his caravan, still attempting to restore order to the papers scattered during the break-in. The carnival owner looked up wearily as Poirot entered, his face showing the strain of recent events. "Mr. Hartwell, I believe the time has come for complete honesty," Poirot began, settling into a chair across from the older man. "We now know that multiple people had reasons to want Reginald Ashworth dead, and that several of those people were present at the carnival that evening." Hartwell set down the papers he was sorting, his movements those of a man who had been expecting this conversation. "What do you want to know?" "The truth about your war service together, and what he was threatening to expose." Hartwell was quiet for so long that Poirot wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain and guilt that had been carried for years. "During the war, our unit was stationed near a French village that had been partially evacuated due to the advancing German lines. There were stores of supplies, food, medical equipment, personal belongings that had been abandoned by civilians fleeing the fighting. And you participated in looting these supplies." Hartwell's face aged visibly as he recalled those dark days. "I was young, hungry, and far from home. At first it seemed harmless enough. We were taking things that appeared to have been abandoned, supplies that might otherwise fall into German hands anyway. But the situation escalated. Reginald discovered where the villagers had hidden their valuables before fleeing: jewelry, money, family heirlooms that represented their life savings. He organized a systematic operation to recover and divide these treasures among the men." Hartwell's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "When I realized we were stealing from civilians who had already lost everything else to the war, I tried to stop it. But Reginald had documentation, photographs, evidence that could have seen us all court-martialed and executed for looting. This provided another compelling motive for murder. But like Weber's story and Mrs. Blackwood's revelation, it didn't explain the mechanical details of how the crime had been committed. Poirot was beginning to suspect that the solution lay not in any single person's guilt, but in a more complex arrangement of circumstances and intentions. As afternoon turned to evening, he made his way back to the Hall of Mirrors for one final examination of the scene. The attraction remained closed while the police investigation continued, leaving Poirot alone with the maze of reflections and secrets. Standing in the central chamber where Ashworth had died, surrounded by the mirrors that had witnessed the crime, Poirot felt the solution beginning to crystallize in his mind. The answer had been there all along, hidden not by what the mirrors revealed, but by what they concealed. Chapter 8: The Vanishing Blade. That evening, as the carnival prepared for what would unknowingly be its final night of operation in Brighton, Poirot gathered the key suspects in the closed hall of mirrors. Inspector Meadows had arranged for the attraction to be completely sealed off from the public, creating an intimate theatre for what promised to be the revelation of a most complex truth. Present were Klaus Weber, Geoffrey and Timothy Hartwell, Mrs. Henrietta Blackwood, Ernest and Dorothy Ventnor, and Catherine Ashworth, who had remained in Brighton to handle her brother's affairs and had been staying at the same hotel where he had met his end. Each face reflected a different combination of anxiety, curiosity, and carefully concealed guilt as they gathered in the central chamber. The space felt different with all the participants assembled together. The mirrors seemed to multiply not just their physical forms but their nervous energy, creating an atmosphere of tension that was almost palpable. Electric lights had been specially installed for this demonstration, casting dramatic shadows that danced across the reflective surfaces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect chamber, "we gather tonight to resolve a mystery that has appeared impossible: how a man could be murdered in a room with no exit, with no weapon, and with no apparent opportunity for the killer to escape undetected." He gestured gracefully to the mirrors surrounding them, their surfaces catching and multiplying the electric lights in endless recursive patterns. "These mirrors have been our witnesses throughout this investigation, but like all witnesses, they can deceive as well as reveal. The solution to this case lies not in what we have seen but in what we have assumed to be true." Inspector Meadows shifted uncomfortably, his practical mind struggling with the theatrical nature of Poirot's presentation. "Are you saying the man wasn't actually murdered, Poirot?" "Oh, he was most certainly murdered, mon ami. But the method was far more clever and infinitely more cruel than we initially understood." Poirot moved to the center of the chamber, where chalk still outlined the position where Ashworth's body had been found. "Let us begin with what we know to be true. Reginald Ashworth was a man with many enemies, each with compelling reasons to wish him dead. Mrs. Blackwood sought justice for her nephew's suffering in his squalid properties. Mr. Weber had endured years of exploitation and threats. Mr. Hartwell faced exposure of wartime crimes that could have destroyed his life. Yet none of these individuals could have committed the murder as we initially understood it. Klaus Weber stepped forward nervously, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. "But I told you, I was there when he died. I saw him fall, saw the blood spreading across his shirt." "Indeed you did, Monsieur Weber. But what you witnessed was not the moment of death, but the final act of an elaborate performance that had been months in the planning. You see, Reginald Ashworth was already dying when he entered this chamber that night." The assembled group exchanged puzzled glances, their confusion evident in the multiple reflections that surrounded them. Catherine Ashworth spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. My brother was in good health when he left London. He had mentioned some stomach troubles but nothing serious enough to suggest he was dying." Poirot smiled sadly, his expression reflecting genuine sympathy for the woman's loss. But was he truly in good health, mademoiselle? Tell me, had you noticed any changes in his behavior recently? His eating habits, perhaps, or his daily routines?" Catherine frowned in concentration, her mind clearly working back through recent memories. "Well, yes, actually. He'd been complaining of stomach pains for several weeks, becoming increasingly severe. He said it was just the stress of business pressures, but he'd been taking increasing amounts of patent medicine for digestion and other ailments. Patent medicine that he purchased where? From various chemist shops around London. He said different formulations helped with different symptoms, and he'd become quite particular about which preparations he preferred." Poirot nodded gravely, his suspicions confirmed, "and therein lies the first key to our mystery. Your brother was being slowly poisoned, mademoiselle, by someone who had intimate access to his daily routine and could substitute deadly preparations for his legitimate medications over an extended period." Inspector Meadows leaned forward intently, his professional instincts fully engaged. "Poisoned by whom? And how does that explain what happened here?"
by someone who knew his habits intimately, who could predict his movements with great accuracy, and who had both the knowledge and opportunity to administer the fatal doses gradually over time. Someone who knew that when the poison finally reached its lethal concentration, Reginald Ashworth would be far from London and far from immediate suspicion. Poirot paused dramatically, allowing the implications to settle over the group like a slowly descending shroud. The murderer's plan was ingenious in its simplicity and breathtaking in its cruelty. They knew that Ashworth would come to Brighton. Indeed, they had arranged multiple meetings and pressures to ensure he would be here when the poison reached its final fatal stage. Timothy Hartwell spoke up suddenly, his young voice cutting through the tension. But what about the knife wound? We all saw the blood, the obvious trauma to his chest. Ah yes, the coup de grace that confused everyone so thoroughly. Poirot moved to one of the mirrors and ran his finger carefully along its edge, demonstrating the sharpness of the material. Tell me, Monsieur Weber, when you designed this chamber, what material did you use for the mirror edges and mounting hardware? Weber looked confused by the question but answered automatically. Polished steel, naturally, it provides the cleanest reflection and the most durable mounting system. Each mirror must be precisely cut and mounted to achieve the proper optical effects. And these edges, they are quite sharp. Well, yes, they must be precisely machined to achieve perfect optical clarity. I suppose they could be dangerous if someone fell against them with sufficient force. Poirot turned back to the group, his green eyes reflecting the terrible understanding he had reached. The knife wound that killed Reginald Ashworth was not inflicted by a traditional weapon wielded by human hands but by the mirror itself. When the poison finally overcame him, causing the violent convulsions and disorientation characteristic of certain toxic substances, he collapsed forward onto the razor-sharp edge of the mirror behind him. Mrs. Blackwood gasped, her hand flying to her throat. But that would mean it was an accident. The final wound itself, perhaps, but the circumstances that led to it were carefully orchestrated over many weeks. The murderer knew that the poison they had been administering would cause violent convulsions and complete disorientation in its final stages. They chose this location specifically because of the deadly mirrors surrounding their victim. Ernest Ventnor raised his hand hesitantly, his methodical mind struggling with the implications. But how could anyone predict exactly where he would fall? It seems like such an uncertain method. They couldn't predict the exact mechanism, Poirot replied. But with 12 sharp-edged mirrors surrounding the chamber, the odds were heavily in favor of a fatal outcome regardless of the specific direction of collapse. The murderer had created what we might call a death trap, a space where any sudden loss of control would likely prove fatal. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the electric lights and the distant sound of waves against the pier. Poirot could see understanding beginning to dawn on several faces, but the most crucial revelation was yet to come. The mirrors reflected their shocked faces infinitely, creating a kaleidoscope of horror and realization that seemed to stretch into eternity. Somewhere in those endless reflections lay the final truth that would bring this elaborate charade to its conclusion. Chapter 9. The Puppet Master. But who? Catherine Ashworth's voice was barely a whisper, her words seeming to echo endlessly among the surrounding mirrors. Who could have planned such an elaborate and heartless scheme? Poirot walked slowly around the circular chamber, his reflection multiplying in the mirrors as he moved. Each step was deliberate, calculated, as if he were performing a carefully choreographed dance with the truth itself. The electric lights cast shifting shadows that made his movements appear both real and illusory simultaneously. To answer that question, we must consider who had access to the victim's daily routine over an extended period, who possessed the necessary knowledge of chemistry and human psychology, and who had both the motive and the opportunity to orchestrate such an elaborate plan. He stopped in front of one particular mirror, studying not his own reflection but that of the person standing behind him. The glass revealed layers of truth and deception, just as the case itself had done throughout the investigation. We must also ask ourselves who benefited most from ensuring that Reginald Ashworth died away from London, in circumstances that would make investigation difficult and suspicion diffuse among multiple plausible suspects. Inspector Meadows was growing visibly impatient with the theatrical presentation. For heaven's sake, Poirot, just tell us who committed this elaborate murder. Very well. Poirot turned to face the assembled group, his green eyes settling on one particular face with the inexorable precision of a predator focusing on its prey. The murderer is someone who has been present throughout our investigation, someone who has guided our assumptions and influenced our understanding of events from the very beginning, someone who knew that we would focus on the impossibility of the crime rather than questioning whether the crime happened as we believed. The tension in the chamber was almost unbearable as everyone waited for the revelation. The mirrors seemed to lean inward, as if they too were eager to hear the truth they had been concealing. The murderer, Poirot said with quiet finality, is Miss Catherine Ashworth. The accused woman's composure cracked for just a moment, a fleeting expression of surprise and calculation that was quickly suppressed before reasserting itself with remarkable control. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though a careful observer might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands. That's completely absurd, Mr. Poirot. Reginald was my brother. I loved him dearly despite his faults. You loved the memory of the brother who sacrificed his own education for yours, Poirot corrected gently, his tone containing both understanding and implacable determination. But you despised the man he had become, a landlord who exploited the poor and desperate, a man whose very existence was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from the idealistic young person you remembered from your childhood. Catherine's face had gone pale, but she maintained her dignity with the skill of someone who had been preparing for this moment. Even if that were true, how could I have arranged his death? I was in London when he died, hundreds of miles away. Indeed you were, which is precisely what made your plan so brilliant. Poirot began to pace slowly as he explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone unraveling a masterpiece of criminal planning. You see, mesdames et messieurs, this was not a crime of passion but a masterpiece of long-term strategic thinking. Miss Ashworth spent months preparing for her brother's death. He paused before continuing, allowing the full weight of the accusation to settle over the assembled group. First she established the means, gradually replacing his digestive medicines with preparations containing increasing amounts of arsenic. The symptoms would perfectly mimic his existing stomach complaints, ensuring he would continue taking the poison willingly while attributing his worsening condition to business stress. Timothy Hartwell interrupted, his young voice filled with confusion. But how did she know he would come to Brighton? How could she predict his movements so precisely? Because she arranged it, mon ami. You see, Miss Ashworth was not merely Reginald's sister, she was also his anonymous blackmailer. The revelation sent a shock wave through the assembled group. Catherine's face remained impassive, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of a chair for support. The threatening letters that brought him here, the pressure that drove him to seek multiple meetings in Brighton, the mysterious correspondent who signed only with the initial N, all of these were written by his own sister, using information gleaned from years of listening to his confessions of guilt about his business practices and wartime experiences. Poirot moved closer to Catherine, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. You knew exactly which buttons to push, which secrets to threaten, which pressure points would drive him to desperation. The letter found in his hotel room, demanding a meeting, that was your handwriting, carefully disguised but bearing the distinctive characteristics that handwriting experts have now confirmed. Inspector Meadows frowned, his practical mind still struggling with the complexity of the scheme. But why go to such elaborate lengths? If she wanted him dead, surely there were simpler methods available. Ah, but that is where the true genius of the plan reveals itself, Poirot replied, his admiration for the scheme's complexity evident despite his moral condemnation of its purpose. Miss Ashworth didn't simply want her brother dead, she wanted him thoroughly discredited, and his death to appear as the natural consequence of his own actions. He turned back to face Catherine directly. You see, under the terms of their parents' will, if Reginald died with his reputation intact, his considerable wealth would pass to various charitable organizations as specified in his testament. But if he died while under investigation for criminal activities, or if his death appeared to be connected to his business practices, the money would revert to the family, specifically to his sister. Poirot's voice grew harder as he continued. You needed him to be seen as a criminal deserving of his fate, not as a victim worthy of sympathy. So you created multiple suspects, each with compelling motives and opportunities. You ensured that his final days would be spent in Brighton, surrounded by people who had genuine reasons to want him dead. Catherine's composure finally began to crack under the relentless pressure of Poirot's deductions. "You're quite wrong about the letters," she said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. "But I am not wrong, mademoiselle. The handwriting analysis that Inspector Meadows commissioned confirms that the anonymous letters match samples of your correspondence retrieved from your brother's papers. More damning still, the expensive stationery used for the threats was purchased from Harrods using your personal account. We have the receipts." For the first time, Catherine's composure cracked completely. She sank into a chair that Timothy hastily provided, her face buried in her hands as the weight of discovery settled upon her. "He destroyed so many lives," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands. "The families in his boarding houses, living in squalor while he grew rich from their desperation. Young men like Klaus who were trapped by his threats and exploitation, even during the war, when others were sacrificing everything for their country, he saw only opportunities for personal profit. And so you appointed yourself judge, jury and executioner," Poirot said, his voice containing both condemnation and a trace of understanding. "You planned his death with the precision of a chess master, ensuring that when the final moment came, he would be surrounded by mirrors that would turn his own collapse into the instrument of his destruction." The chamber fell silent as the full enormity of the crime sank in. It had been a murder of extraordinary sophistication, requiring months of preparation, intimate knowledge of chemistry and human psychology, and a complete understanding of her brother's character and weaknesses. Inspector Meadows stepped forward with his handcuffs, but Catherine held up one trembling hand. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly, her voice barely audible in the mirrored space, "something that will complicate your neat explanation of events." Poirot raised an eyebrow, sensing that even now, at the moment of revelation, there were additional layers to this complex crime. "I'm not the only one who wanted justice for my brother's victims," Catherine continued, looking around the chamber at the assembled faces, "and I wasn't acting entirely alone in arranging his death." The mirrors reflected her words back endlessly, each repetition seeming to carry additional weight and meaning. The case that had seemed to be reaching its conclusion was about to reveal one final crucial twist. Chapter 10, The Mirror's Final Reflection. Catherine Ashworth's final revelation cast the entire case in a new and more complex light. As Inspector Meadows waited with the handcuffs, she looked around the chamber at the assembled faces, some shocked, some sympathetic, some relieved that the truth was finally emerging from the maze of deception and illusion. "You're quite right, Mr. Poirot, that I orchestrated Reginald's death through careful poisoning over many weeks," she said, her voice growing steadier as she unburdened herself of the complete truth. "But I wasn't acting alone in the final stages of the plan. Klaus knew about the poison, and had agreed to ensure that if my brother simply collapsed without falling onto the mirror's edge, the death could be completed by other means." Weber's face went ashen, and he removed his glasses with hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped them. "Catherine, no, we agreed to say nothing about it's over, Klaus. The truth deserves to be told completely, without any further deception or half measures." She looked back at Poirot with something approaching gratitude in her eyes. "When I learned about Klaus's years of suffering at my brother's hands, I reached out to him through a mutual acquaintance. We discovered we had a common goal, justice for Reginald's victims, and a shared understanding of how dangerous he had become." Poirot nodded slowly, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his methodical mind, and Monsieur Weber provided the technical expertise for the final stage of the plan. The hidden door in the mirror, that was not built solely for maintenance purposes, was it? Weber replaced his glasses with trembling hands before responding, his German accent becoming more pronounced under stress. "No. Catherine needed someone to be present when the poison took its final effect, to ensure that if Reginald simply collapsed without falling onto the mirror's edge in a fatal manner, there would be someone present to complete what we had started. But that proved unnecessary," Catherine continued, her voice taking on an oddly clinical tone as she described the final moments of her elaborate plan. "When Klaus saw Reginald beginning to convulse from the arsenic poisoning, he hid in the passage behind the mirror and waited. The fall onto the steel edge happened naturally, exactly as we had hoped it might. Mrs. Blackwood spoke up, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and reluctant understanding. So when I heard two voices arguing in the chamber, one of them was Klaus hidden behind the mirror. No, Catherine replied, shaking her head. Klaus never spoke to Reginald that evening. It was too dangerous to reveal his presence. The second voice you heard was my brother arguing with himself, a common effect of arsenic poisoning in its final stages. The toxin causes delirium and auditory hallucinations, making victims believe they're engaged in conversations with people who aren't actually present.
The elegant simplicity of the murder plan was now fully revealed in all its cold-blooded sophistication. Catherine had orchestrated events so that multiple suspects would be present, each providing a plausible alternative theory for the crime. The seemingly impossible nature of the murder had focused attention on the mechanical aspects, how someone could escape from a locked room, rather than questioning whether the crime had happened as it appeared. Inspector Meadows stepped forward again, his duty clear despite the complexity of the case. Miss Ashworth, Klaus Weber, I'm arresting you both for the murder of Reginald Ashworth. You have the right to, Inspector, Catherine interrupted quietly. Before you complete the formalities, there's one more thing you should understand about why we did this. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a thick folder of documents and photographs. These are records of every family destroyed by my brother's business practices, children who died from diseases caused by unsanitary conditions, elderly people who froze to death because he refused to provide adequate heating, workers who were trapped in his buildings when fires broke out because he had blocked emergency exits to prevent theft. The photographs were horrifying, images of squalid living conditions, overcrowded rooms, structural damage that had been ignored for years. Each document told a story of human suffering that had been callously ignored in pursuit of profit. Klaus wasn't his only victim, Catherine continued as the handcuffs clicked into place. There were dozens of others, people who had been threatened, exploited, or destroyed by Reginald's greed. We didn't just commit murder, Mr. Poirot. We prevented dozens of future murders that would have been committed through deliberate negligence and cruelty. Klaus Weber, now also in handcuffs, looked at Poirot with something approaching relief. Thank you for understanding the complexity of what we did, even if you cannot approve of our methods. Not all justice comes through the courts, particularly when the courts themselves can be corrupted by wealth and influence. Indeed, Monsieur Weber, Poirot replied gravely, but justice obtained through murder inevitably creates new victims, in this case yourselves. The cycle of violence and revenge rarely brings the peace that its perpetrators seek. As the police led the two conspirators away, the remaining members of the group slowly filed out of the Hall of Mirrors. The attraction that had been the scene of such elaborate deception would never be the same, its mirrors forever tainted by the knowledge of what they had witnessed. Geoffrey Hartwell lingered for a moment, looking around the chamber that had been the culmination of Weber's engineering genius and Catherine's criminal planning. What will happen to all this now? He asked. Gesturing at the elaborate maze of mirrors and illusions, Poirot considered the question carefully, his green eyes reflecting in the surrounding glass. I suspect, monsieur, that the carnival will move on, as carnivals always do. But this particular attraction, he paused, studying his own reflection multiplied endlessly in the surrounding mirrors. Perhaps some illusions are too dangerous to maintain. When the power to deceive becomes the power to destroy, it may be time to shatter the mirrors that enable such deceptions. 3 days later, as Poirot prepared to return to London, he received word that the Hall of Mirrors had been voluntarily dismantled by Geoffrey Hartwell. The mirrors were sold separately to various buyers throughout England, their collective power to create elaborate illusions broken along with the unity of their carefully calculated arrangement. The Brighton Summer Carnival departed that weekend, leaving behind only trampled grass and fading memories of its brief but memorable presence on the pier. The case that had seemed impossible had proven to be all too possible, requiring only the kind of meticulous planning and intimate knowledge that could exist between family members, even when that family bond had been twisted into something dark and vengeful. Standing on the train platform, waiting for the London Express, Poirot reflected on the nature of justice and revenge, and how the mirrors of human motivation could distort truth just as effectively as those made of glass and steel. The case had been solved, but its resolution brought no real satisfaction, only the melancholy knowledge that sometimes the most elaborate schemes arise from the simplest of emotions, the desire to right an unrightable wrong. As the train pulled away from Brighton station, Poirot could see the pier in the distance, empty now of its colourful carnival attractions. The Hall of Mirrors was gone, but the memory of its deadly reflections would remain, a reminder that in the game of murder, as in all games of illusion, nothing is ever quite what it appears to be. The case was closed, but the questions it raised about justice, family loyalty, and the price of moral compromise would linger far longer than the memory of the carnival that had provided its stage. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that some reflections once seen can never be unseen, and some truths, once revealed, change everything that comes after. Catherine Ashworth and Klaus Weber would face trial for their elaborate crime, their carefully constructed plan having been unravelled by the patient observation and methodical deduction that characterized all of Poirot's investigations. The mirrors had finally revealed their secrets, but the cost of that revelation would echo through many lives for years to come. This concludes our tale from the Hall of Mirrors. I'm Stephen, and thank you for joining me for another mystery from Cozy Mysteries, where every reflection tells a story, and every story holds secrets waiting to be discovered. Until next time, remember that the truth, like light itself, can be bent and distorted by the mirrors we create, but it can never be permanently hidden from those with the patience and skill to look beyond the illusions.